All right. Now, for this specialty, our last specialty, we're going to focus on a fun topic of crisis communication. It's fun, and as I like to say, it's fun for all the wrong reasons, depending on the audience. And usually, if it's an organization, they think about crisis as being a bad thing. So, this one is a topic that's it's interesting. There's a lot to it. I teach an entire course on crisis communication where we walk through a whole semester, of course, of focusing on crises and how to game plan around crises. And so we're just going to hit a few of these things. But I wanted to, if you look on the left of the screen right there, if you see, I've got all the different topics that we've talked about: identity, image, relationships, reputation, strategy, campaigns, media, internal, external communication. I want you to think about the game changer for all of those could be crisis communication. There's a couple ways I want you to think about that. One is crisis could do damage to all of those things, right? Make all of those things irrelevant. Or if all of those things are done well, they can help be a buffer in time of a crisis. So I put crisis near the end at the end here for a reason, right? Because it's one of those, it's a wild card, it's a game changer. It could absolutely threaten all those things, but if done well, they give you what you need in a time of crisis. And we'll walk through that as we go. So I want to start off, thought it might be kind of fun to get us to think a little bit about some different crises. And maybe what you could do now is kind of, pause this and write down a few crises that you can think of that have happened recently. But let's walk through it first. A few years ago, Volkswagen went through a crisis of emissions testing where they admitted to lying about emissions. There's a series on Netflix right now called Dirty Money, and they have a whole 50-minute episode on Volkswagen. I would highly recommend that one. Facebook, right? They had an issue recently where all the different breaches, right? Where the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they've had their share of issues going on. United Airlines have had their share of issues, right? Dragging a passenger off the plane, for instance. Chipotle had toxic burritos and rice and all kinds of stuff. Marriott had a data breach. Who hasn't had data breaches? Wells Fargo had an account scandal, which turned out to be a massive crisis. You should look up the fine amounts of that. Unreal. Papa John's, turns out Papa is a total creepwad. Toxic culture, right? Just a womanizer and just horrible, horrible things. And so anyway, if you're not familiar with that, look that one up. Of course, Penn State and the Jerry Sandusky case. A lot has been written about that. That one's well known. I don't know if you've heard about this one, but 38 minutes. What you think about 38 minutes was the amount of time after residents in Hawaii got this message. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. For 38 minutes, everybody who subscribed to the emergency alert system got this message. So can you imagine that for 38 minutes thinking that there was an inbound missile coming to Hawaii? This is a true story, and all that happened was an intern pushed the wrong button. So an employee pushed the wrong button, and instead of a test message, this message went out. So can you imagine 38 minutes of panic and terror and crazy, crazy, crazy stuff? If you haven't heard about that story, look it up. Okay, there's just a few examples. There's so many more out there. So I want to just jump in with some definitions for us to think about. The first is it's an issue, which think about it as an event or a situation that requires decisive and immediate action. It's a critical and intense issue or event or situation that threatens the existence of an organization. Think about that in terms of its assumptions, values, and ways of operating. Here's what I want to underscore there. Its existence is broadly defined. Its basic assumptions, what it's about, its values. So not just its actual existence. It may exist. It's got to completely reboot. Think about like if you go through a trauma in your life or somebody, chances are it probably uproots a lot of things. It's a crisis and they got to change a lot. Same with organizations. And then basic ways of operating, right? I think Chipotle, for instance, has redone a lot of how they source, how they source their foods, and so it upsets and changes a lot. It's a massive, in some cases, a seismic shift for an organization. So a couple of things I want us to think about. This one I think this is one of the best perspectives or definitions of what crisis is about. Think about it, it impacts 5 things. For it to be a crisis, it must impact these 5 things: people, the environment, business operations, reputation, that's a keyword for us, right? And then the bottom line, of course. So people, environment, business operations, reputation, bottom line. Key though is it must impact over the long term. It doesn't have to impact all of these necessarily, but it must impact at least one or several of these. And you might think about it like you might have something that doesn't really, that impacts people in a major way over the long term, right? It has harm to people, which is naturally going to hurt the bottom line and probably going to change business operations. So in other words, they're not mutually exclusive. But this framework is, in my opinion, the best definition of a frame, in terms of a framework of what crisis is about: people, the environment, operations, reputation, long term. So it's gotta impact all those for it to be a crisis. If not, it may just be a hassle. It may just be an embarrassment, right? Nowadays, people will post something on social media and it's embarrassing for an organization, but may not be a crisis if it doesn't impact these things. Another thing I want us to think about, of course, reputation is maybe one of the most important terms we've talked about in this course, but you might think about, typically we think about crisis having a negative impact on reputation. So for instance, with BP, I mean, not only did it cost them a lot of money, but it did damage what to people? 12 rig workers died. Was it 12? Actually, I think 12 people. It impacted the environment, right? The oil leaked for like 150 days afterwards. It impacted all those things over the long term. If you haven't seen the movie Deepwater Horizon, go see it. Get it. It's really good. It covers the disaster. The other thing you might think about, though, is that all the things that we've talked about all in the course, a positive image, a positive reputation, great employee relationships, all these different all these relationships within society that organizations have relationships with can provide a buffer, right? So for instance, if Whole Foods had a major thing happen, chances are because of their well-treated employees, positive reputation in the community, people are probably going to give them a little bit of a buffer, a little bit of benefit of the doubt, right? Think about it as reputational capital, right? They're going to give them benefit of the doubt if they have a good reputation, right? Doesn't mean they won't hold them accountable, but they may give them a little space. Whereas BP, some cases, Walmart, McDonald's, we're not giving them much wiggle room because of their history. So when we think about it, crisis, oftentimes we think about responses. Like a crisis happens, what does an organization say? What do they do? So I want you to think about a range. If an organization is not responsible, right, that dictates a certain level of response. If they are responsible and it's clear, then they have to respond accordingly. So I'll just put all these up here so we can look at them. But basically, it goes from non-existence, we're not responsible, we didn't do that, to kind of trying to push away. Maybe it was an employee, for instance, right? They're kind of trying to distance themselves a little bit. Suffering would be what we call victimage. Like, if there was a terrorist attack, for instance, they could be somewhat responsible if they didn't have good procedures in place, which is why it's kind of in the middle. And then we want to associate, it's kind of in the middle there, associate ourselves with positive. We want to bolster our reputation. Hey, I know this happened, but look what we've done. Whereas on the other side, if you're clearly responsible, then you have no choice but to accept it. So a couple of years ago, our mayor in Nashville went through a major crisis where she, her affair. And so she had to, of course, accept the responsibility because she was clearly responsible for that. So again, that dictates a certain kind of response. The last framework I want us to think about is not just about the response in crisis, but our organization's crisis ready. So remember we talked about how it was about organization being a threat to their operations, threat to their fundamental ways of being. This is a framework that I found to be one of the best. Melissa Agnes is top-notch expert. You should look her up. Top-notch expert. This is actually the textbook that I use when I teach crisis, but she's got massive clients. She's spoken at the Pentagon. NATO is one of her clients. The YMCA, massive city governments are her clients. She talks about being crisis ready. So from the ground up, take a look at some of those terms. An organization being ready in the crisis for its mindset and its culture, understanding the organization and society, right? The stakeholders, performing action plans and communication strategy and campaigns. Is this all sounding familiar? So here's the takeaway. All the stuff that we've talked about all course, comes into play here when it comes to crisis in terms of the overall holistic understanding of organizations and society.